Sometimes the richest hearts find true wealth not in money, but in the laughter of a child and the kindness of a stranger. Edward Langston sat in the back of his sleek black car, scrolling through endless business reports on his tablet. The city lights flashed by the tinted windows, but he barely noticed. He was a man who had everything: money, power, respect, but none of it filled the quiet in his home. His 6-year-old son, Oliver, sat next to him, holding a small blue toy car, spinning its wheels without a word. Ever since Oliver's mother had passed away, the boy had grown quieter each day. Tutors came and went, nannies were hired and fired, and the big mansion felt more like a museum than a home. Edward believed he could fix things by paying for the best private lessons. Psychologists, even art therapists, but nothing seemed to reach his son. The boy didn't laugh, didn't talk much, and barely ate. Edward was beginning to feel helpless, though he would never admit that out loud. That evening, Edward had a late meeting near one of his new company sites on the outskirts of town. It ran longer than expected, and by the time he was done, both he and Oliver were hungry. His driver suggested a small diner nearby. Edward normally avoided places like that: too noisy, too messy. But Oliver's little stomach growled softly, and he gave in. "Fine," he said. "Let's eat there." The diner was the kind of place Edward never entered. The smell of fried food filled the air, the floor squeaked, and the tables were close together. But Oliver's eyes lit up at the sight of the spinning dessert display on the counter. They took a seat in the corner booth, and Edward ordered pancakes for Oliver and black coffee for himself. He checked his phone while waiting, sending off quick replies to his assistants, not really seeing the people around him. A few minutes later, the waitress came over, a young woman with tired eyes and a bright smile. Her name tag said Sophie. We greeted them warmly. "Evening. What can I get for you guys tonight?" Edward barely looked up, answering with short words, but Oliver stared at her curiously. She had a messy ponytail, flour on her apron, and a tiny pencil tucked behind her ear. She spoke to Oliver directly. "And what about you, champ? You'd like your pancakes with syrup or strawberries?" Oliver hesitated, then whispered, "Strawberries." Sophie grinned. "Excellent choice. You've got great taste." For the first time that day, a small smile tugged at Oliver's lips. Edward noticed, but said nothing. When Sophie left to take their order, he glanced at his son and thought, at least she got him to respond. A few minutes later, Sophie returned with their plates. As she leaned over to place Oliver's pancakes on the table, his little blue toy car slipped from his hand and rolled under the booth. Oliver's eyes widened. His favorite toy was gone. He climbed down from the seat and got on his knees, peering under the booth. "It went under there," he said softly. Edward sighed, ready to call the waiter to help, but before he could speak, Sophie knelt down beside Oliver. "Let's find it together, partner," she said with a playful grin. Without hesitation, she crawled on the diner's floor with him, her hair falling loose as she reached under the booth. "I see it, but it's hiding from us," she whispered dramatically. Oliver giggled for the first time in weeks. "I can get it," he said, reaching out beside her. Edward stared, almost stunned. Sophie didn't seem to care that she was wearing an apron or that people were watching. She laughed softly when she bumped her head on the table leg. And when Oliver finally pulled the toy out, she clapped her hands as if he'd just won a race. "Mission accomplished," she said cheerfully, dusting off her knees. Oliver grinned from ear to ear, clutching his toy like a treasure. Edward felt something stir in his chest, a mix of surprise and confusion. No one had made his son smile like that in months. The sight of the waitress crawling on the floor might have seemed ridiculous to some, but to Edward it was almost unbelievable. He had hired professionals with fancy degrees who couldn't reach Oliver. Yet here was a simple diner waitress doing it without even trying. When Sophie got up, she brushed off her apron and winked at Oliver. "Next time your car goes exploring, call me. I'm a professional car rescuer." Oliver giggled again, his eyes bright. Edward couldn't remember the last time he had heard that sound. Throughout dinner, Sophie checked on them often. She didn't treat Edward like someone important. She just talked to them like ordinary people. When Oliver didn't want to eat his pancakes, She leaned close and said, "If you eat 3 bites, I'll tell you the secret of the world's fluffiest pancake." Oliver took the challenge seriously and began eating. Edward almost smiled. Sophie chatted about silly things, how the coffee machine made strange noises, how her cat liked to steal toast, how she once tried to bake a cake and it exploded. Oliver listened with wide eyes, laughing quietly. Edward found himself listening too, even though he pretended not to. When the meal was over, Sophie brought the check with a cheerful hope, "You both had a good adventure tonight." Edward nodded, slipping his credit card into the folder. "You're very good with children," he said in his calm, businesslike tone. Sophie smiled. "Kids are easy. You just have to get on their level." She didn't mean it as a lesson, but Edward felt the words hit him harder than expected. As they left, Oliver turned to look back at her. "Bye, Sophie," he said, waving his small hand. Sophie waved back with a big smile. "See you later, car rescuer." Outside, the night air was cool. Edward opened the car door for his son and paused for a moment before getting in himself. He looked through the diner's glass window and saw Sophie serving another table, laughing with an elderly couple. She looked tired but happy. The drive home was quiet. Oliver hugged his toy car and stared out the window. After a while, he said softly, "Daddy, Sophie's funny." Edward looked at him through the mirror. "Yes," he replied. "She is." When they reached the mansion, the lights felt colder than usual. The housekeeper greeted them, and the chef asked if they wanted dessert, but Edward waved everyone away. He helped Oliver get ready for bed. For the first time in months, Oliver talked a little as he brushed his teeth. He asked if they could go to the same diner again. Edward didn't answer right away. "Maybe," he said quietly, after putting Oliver to bed. Edward stood in the doorway for a long time, watching his son sleep. There was a faint smile on the boy's face. Edward couldn't remember the last time he had seen that. It made something ache deep inside him. He walked down to his office and sat at his desk. But the spreadsheets and reports suddenly seemed meaningless. He couldn't stop thinking about that moment, the waitress kneeling on the floor beside his son, laughing as if the whole world was just a game. Edward realized something that night. Money couldn't buy what Sophie had given his son in just a few minutes: joy. She had made him laugh, made him feel seen, made him forget his sadness, even if only for a moment. Before going to bed, Edward looked out the window toward the dark city. He felt strangely unsettled, almost humbled. He didn't know why this ordinary young woman had affected him so much. But he knew one thing for sure. Oliver needed that kind of light in his life again. And for the first time in a long while, Edward Langston wondered if maybe he did too. Edward Langston couldn't get that small-town diner out of his mind. It had been days since he and Oliver had gone there, yet the image of the young waitress crawling on the floor beside his son kept replaying in his head. He had seen thousands of people in his life: powerful executives, polished investors, trained therapists, but no one had managed to make his son laugh the way she had. Sophie. He remembered her name clearly. The way she smiled with her whole face, the way she didn't treat him like someone important. It was strange because people always treated Edward with distance or fear. They spoke carefully around him, trying to impress him or gain something. But Sophie hadn't cared who he was. She just talked and laughed as if he were any other tired father eating dinner with his kid. Oliver hadn't stopped mentioning her either. Every morning at breakfast, he asked, "Can we go to the pancake place again, Daddy?" Edward pretended to be too busy. "We'll see," he'd say, hiding behind his coffee cup. But deep down, he wanted to go too. He told himself it was only for Oliver, that he wanted to see his son happy again. Yet part of him was curious about the girl who didn't fit into his perfect, organized world. A few evenings later, after another long day of meetings, Edward found himself driving past that same diner. He told his driver to stop. Oliver's eyes lit up instantly when he saw the glowing sign. "Are we really eating here again?" he asked excitedly. Edward gave a small smile. "I suppose we are." The diner looked the same, warm light spilling out onto the sidewalk, laughter coming from inside, the smell of fresh coffee and fries filling the air. When they entered, Sophie was behind the counter, tying her apron. The moment she saw Oliver, her face lit up. "Hey, my favorite car rescuer," she said. Oliver ran up to her, proudly showing his toy car. "I didn't lose it this time." Sophie laughed. "Good. I was ready to call a rescue mission if you did." Edward sat at their usual booth, pretending to look at the menu, even though he already knew what they'd order. Sophie came over with a playful smile. "Back so soon? Couldn't resist my world-famous pancakes?" Edward raised an eyebrow. "My son insisted," he said calmly. Sophie leaned closer, whispering to Oliver, "It's okay. I know it was actually him." Oliver giggled, and even Edward's lips twitched a little dot. As they ate, Edward watched the two of them. Sophie talked about the silly customers she'd met that day. How she once served pancakes to a man who tried to pay with buttons, and how her cat had knocked over a jug of milk that morning. Oliver laughed at every word. Edward listened quietly, realizing how peaceful it felt to just sit there and hear his son laugh. When Sophie brought their food, she noticed Edward's half-smile and said, "You know, you look less serious when you're not frowning." He blinked, surprised. People rarely spoke to him that way. "I'm not used to people telling me that," he replied dryly. Sophie shrugged. "Maybe they should. Smiling suits you better." Then she turned and walked away to serve another table. Edward watched her go, almost amused. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had spoken to him so casually after dinner. Sophie gave Oliver a small cup with 2 marshmallows. "A secret treat for brave car rescuers," she said. Oliver beamed. When they were leaving, Sophie waved at both of them. "Bye, serious man. Bye, pancake hero." On the way home, Oliver chattered the whole ride about Sophie, how funny she was, how she made the best pancakes, how she told stories about her cat. Edward listened, his heart warming a little. "She's nice, isn't she?" Oliver said. Edward nodded. "She is." A few days later, Oliver came running into his father's office holding a colorful flyer. "Daddy, there's a family day at my school. Can Sophie come?" Edward looked up from his computer, confused. "Sophie, the waitress." Oliver nodded eagerly. "She said she'd come if you said yes." Edward blinked. He didn't remember Sophie agreeing to that, but he could imagine her saying it just to make Oliver happy. He hesitated. The idea of inviting a diner waitress to a private school event felt unusual. His world didn't mix with hers. But then he looked at Oliver's hopeful face and sighed. "All right," he said finally. "She can come." Oliver jumped and hugged him tightly. It was such a pure reaction that Edward couldn't help but smile. On the day of the event, Edward drove Oliver to school. Sophie met them outside the gate, a little out of breath, her apron gone, but her hair still messy. She wore a simple floral dress that looked cheerful against the gray sky. "Sorry I'm late," she said, smiling nervously. "Got stuck helping a customer with a flat tire." Edward almost laughed it. Sounded exactly like her. During the event, Oliver ran around happily, showing Sophie his classroom, his drawings, and his friends. Edward stayed close, watching from a distance. Sophie clapped the loudest during Oliver's little poem recital, and even teared up a bit when he finished. Edward noticed and felt something tighten in his chest. Afterward, when most parents were chatting in groups, Edward saw Sophie standing alone by the fence. He walked over. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. She looked up at him and smiled. "Oliver's a wonderful kid. You should be proud," he nodded. "I am." They stood in silence for a moment. Then he asked, "Do you live nearby?" She shook her head. "No. I live 2 towns over. The bus ride's long, but I manage." He frowned. "Why not move closer?" She gave a small laugh. "Can't afford the rent around here, but it's okay." He hesitated. "If you ever need help," she'll cut him off gently. "I don't need help, Mr. Langston. I just need my job." He looked at her, trying to understand. She wasn't being rude. She was just proud. It struck him that she lived a life completely opposite to his, yet she seemed far more content. There was something about her that didn't fit into the world of money and business deals. She was simple, yes, but there was a strength behind that simplicity. That night, when Edward put Oliver to bed, his son hugged him and whispered, "I like Sophie. She makes everything fun." Edward kissed his forehead. "I know," he said softly. Later, sitting alone in his study, Edward thought about Sophie's words. "You can't buy everything." It was true. He had all the money in the world, but he couldn't buy what she had: lightness, warmth, the ability to make people feel alive. He thought about how she had refused his offer to help, and instead of feeling offended, he felt respect. Over the next few days, Edward caught himself thinking about her often, her laughter, her stubborn kindness, the way she looked at Oliver as if he was the most important kid in the world. He didn't know what to call the feeling growing inside him, but it was new. It scared him a little. He began to change in small ways without realizing it. He came home earlier from work, spent more time with Oliver, and even smiled more often. His employees noticed, whispering that the boss seemed different. Edward didn't care what they thought. He cared about something else. Now, something real. Sophie. The waitress who didn't care about money or status had somehow walked into his world and left a mark that wouldn't fade. He didn't know what the future would bring, but one thing was certain: his life. And Oliver's were no longer the same since the day they met her in that little diner. The day of Oliver's school event stayed in Edward's mind for a long time. He had seen Sophie cheering for his son louder than anyone else. She wasn't pretending or trying to impress anyone. She was simply proud of the little boy reading his poem on stage. It was strange for Edward to see someone care so deeply without wanting anything in return. Most people in his world only clapped when they knew a camera was watching. But Sophie's applause came from the heart. That touched him in a way he didn't expect. After the event, Edward found her waiting for the bus outside the school. It had started to rain lightly, and she was holding a small umbrella that barely covered her shoulders. She smiled when she saw him. "Hey, Mr. Langston," she said. "You did great sitting through all that chaos." Edward chuckled softly. "I've been through tougher meetings," Sophie laughed, her eyes bright even in the dull light. "Meetings don't have screaming kids and glitter explosions, though." They talked for a while, standing under the gray sky. Edward noticed how thin her jacket was and how tired she looked, but her voice stayed cheerful. He asked how she managed working so much and still finding time to help Oliver. She shrugged. "You just do what you have to. My brother needs me, so I keep going." Her words made Edward pause. "Your brother?" he asked. Sophie nodded. "Yeah, Max. He's 16. He has cerebral palsy, so he can't move around much. I work double shifts to pay for his therapy in school. It's hard sometimes, but he's my best friend." She smiled, but it was a tired smile, the kind that hides more pain than it shows. Edward felt something stir inside him again. He had never thought about what Sophie's life might be like beyond the diner. She was always smiling, always joking, and he had assumed she was just naturally carefree. But now he saw that behind that laughter was someone strong, carrying heavy responsibilities all on her own. When the bus arrived, Edward offered her a ride. "It's no trouble," he said. "I have a car right here." Sophie hesitated, then shook her head. "Thank you, but I'm fine with the bus. It's my thinking time." She gave him a quick smile and hurried up the steps before he could say another word. As the bus drove away, he stood there for a moment, watching it disappear into the rain. For a man who was used to having everything he wanted, being told no felt strange, but it also made him respect her even more. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He sat by his window, watching the city lights flicker. Sophie's words echoed in his mind. "You just do what you have to." He thought about how hard she worked, not for fame or fortune, but for love for her brother. And he realized how different she was from everyone else he knew. She wasn't chasing success. She was surviving with grace and kindness. The next day, he found himself driving to the diner again, even though he didn't plan to. When he walked in, Sophie looked surprised. "You again?" she said, grinning. "You're going to make people think my pancakes are addictive?" Edward smiled faintly. "Maybe they are," she laughed. "Or maybe you just like the company." Oliver was with him, and as soon as they sat down, Sophie came over with a small plate of cookies. "I made these yesterday," she said. "They might be a bit burnt, but they're still good." Oliver bit one and nodded seriously. "They're perfect." Oh. Sophie winked. "You've got good taste, kid." As they ate, Edward tried to ask her more about herself. He wanted to understand this woman who had somehow changed both his and his son's lives without even realizing it. But Sophie kept turning the conversation back to lighter topics: funny customers, the cook's bad singing, Oliver's drawings. She never complained about her life, not even once. That made Edward admire her even more. After their meal, Edward insisted on paying double the bill. Sophie frowned. "You don't have to do that," she said firmly. "I know you're trying to be nice, but I'm fine." Edward tried to explain. "It's just a tip. You deserve it." She smiled politely, but pushed the extra cash back toward him. "Money isn't what makes me feel appreciated. Just say thank you." It stunned him. No one ever refused his money. People usually wanted more, not less. But Sophie seemed to live by her own rules that didn't depend on wealth or power. It made Edward wonder how she had grown so kind in a world that could be so cruel. A few days later, Oliver had another small event at school, and Sophie showed up again just as she promised. This time, Edward found himself talking to her longer. She told him about Max, how he loved comic books and science, how he dreamed of becoming an engineer even though he could barely hold a pen. Her eyes lit up as she spoke about her brother. "He's the smartest person I know," she said proudly. Edward listened quietly, realizing that her life revolved around love and sacrifice. "Do you ever get tired?" he asked. Sophie smiled faintly. "All the time. But then Max laughs, and it's worth it." On the drive home that night, Edward thought deeply. He had spent years chasing success, building companies, and collecting properties. But now he wondered what it was all for. His son had been lonely. He himself had been empty. And yet this young woman with nothing but a small apartment and a sick brother seemed happier than he had ever been. A few days later, Edward decided to visit Sophie after work. He stopped by the diner, but she wasn't there. One of the cooks told him she'd taken the evening off to care for her brother. Without thinking, Edward asked for her address. He didn't even know what he planned to say. He just felt the need to see if she was all right. When he arrived, found a small, run-down apartment building. He hesitated before knocking on the door. Sophie opened it, looking surprised. "Mr. Langston? What are you doing here?" He felt awkward. "I wanted to check if you were okay." Inside, the place was tiny but clean. There were books stacked on the table, drawings on the wall, and the faint sound of laughter from another room. "That's Max," Sophie said, smiling softly. "He's having a good day." Edward peeked in and saw a teenage boy in a wheelchair, drawing superheroes with shaky hands. When Max noticed him, he waved shyly. "Hi," he said. Edward waved back, feeling a lump in his throat. They talked for a while. Sophie told him about the medical bills, how hard it was to balance everything, and how she sometimes skipped meals to make sure Max had enough. Edward felt helpless. He could solve her problems with a single check, but he knew she wouldn't accept it. Still, he tried. "Let me help," he said quietly. "You don't have to do this alone." Sophie shook her head firmly. "You don't understand. If I take your help, it changes things. I don't want to owe anyone. I just want to live honestly." Edward didn't argue. He simply nodded, though inside he was moved more deeply than he'd ever admit. When he left, Max called out from the other room by Mr. Langston. Edward smiled and waved. That night, as he drove home, his chest felt heavy. He realized that for the first time in years, he had met someone who didn't see him as a billionaire, a businessman, or a powerful man. Sophie saw him as a father. She treated him like a person, and that meant more than anything he could buy. As the city lights blurred past the car window, Edward made a quiet decision. He would change not for appearances or for business, but for Oliver and for himself. He wanted to be someone his son could laugh with again, someone Sophie could look at without pity. For the first time in years, Edward Langston wasn't thinking about money or success. He was thinking about kindness, about love, and about a woman who had shown him what truly mattered without even trying. Edward Langston felt a strange mixture of excitement and nervousness as he prepared to invite Sophie and her brother Max to his mansion. He had never done anything like this before. In his world, people were careful, polite, and measured. There was always a plan, a schedule, a purpose. But inviting a diner, waitress, and her brother into his private home felt unpredictable, even reckless. And yet he wanted it. For Oliver's happiness, for Sophie's comfort, and, he realized, for his own. He called Sophie the day before, carefully choosing his words. "I'd like you and Max to join us for dinner at my house tomorrow evening," he said, trying to sound casual. Sophie paused on the other end of the line. "Your house?" she repeated. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" "I don't want to. I don't know, mess anything up." Edward smiled softly. "It won't be messy. Just come as you are." The next evening, Oliver bounced up and down in the car as they drove to the mansion. "Do you think Sophie will like it, Daddy?" he asked. Edward glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "I think she'll be fine," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. When they arrived, Sophie looked nervous. The mansion was huge, so much bigger than the diner, bigger than anything she had ever seen. Edward could see her eyes widen at the grand staircase, the polished floors, and the shining chandeliers. Max stayed close to her side, his wheelchair rolling quietly across the marble. Edward tried to put them at ease. "This is Oliver's favorite room," he said, opening the door to a brightly decorated playroom. Oliver ran in immediately, showing Sophie his toys and drawings. Max looked around shyly, but smiled as Sophie guided him over to a comfortable chair. Dinner was set in a large, elegant dining room. Edward's staff hovered quietly in the background, ready to serve, but Sophie didn't seem intimidated. She complimented the chef on the smell of the soup, asked questions about the garden, and even made small jokes with the staff. Edward watched, fascinated. She had a way of fitting into a world completely opposite to hers. Without changing who she was, Oliver sat between Edward and Sophie, chatting nonstop. He told stories about school, his friends, and his favorite games. Sophie laughed, encouraging him, making him feel like his words mattered. Edward found himself listening carefully, not interrupting, just absorbing the moment. For the first time in a long while, he felt relaxed in his own home. After the first course, Oliver accidentally knocked over his glass of juice. Normally, Edward would have immediately cleaned it up and scolded him for carelessness, but he found himself pausing. Sophie grabbed a napkin and helped Oliver wipe it up, laughing softly when the juice dripped onto the tablecloth. "Don't worry, accidents happen," she said warmly. Edward realized he didn't feel the urge to lecture or control the situation. He simply helped, silently, beside her. It was different. Max, who had been quiet during the meal, finally spoke up. "I like your dog," he said, pointing to the golden retriever sleeping near the fireplace. Sophie smiled. "He likes making friends," she said. Max's face lit up, and Edward noticed that even his normally shy son felt more relaxed with Sophie and Max around. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Oliver and Max played with some of the toys Edward had set out for him. Sophie sat nearby, chatting with Edward casually. "You seem happier," she said suddenly. Edward was taken aback. "Happier?" he asked. She nodded. "Yeah. Before, you were always serious, always busy. Tonight, you're just here." Her words made him pause. She had seen something he hadn't noticed himself. For a while, they all sat together, talking, laughing, and playing. Edward felt a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Watching Sophie and Max interact with Oliver, seeing the joy she brought into his son's life, made him realize how empty his life had been before. Money and power couldn't give him this. Only people, real connections, could. But the next morning, reality came crashing back. One of Edward's top investors called, concerned about his reputation. "We heard about your dinner," the man said sharply. "You can't be seen associating with ordinary people. It damages your image." Edward listened silently, a knot forming in his stomach. He tried to explain that it was personal, about his son, about his family, but the investor was insistent. You're risking everything. Your board will not be happy. You have to reconsider." Edward ended the call, feeling the familiar pressure of his world pressing down on him. He knew the investor was right in one sense. His social circle, his business associates, his carefully constructed image, would never understand why he was spending time with a waitress and her brother. But he also knew something else. He couldn't take it back. When Sophie came to the diner that afternoon, Edward wasn't there to meet her. She had come expecting to see him or Oliver, but found out that he had canceled his visit. She felt hurt, though she didn't say it aloud. Oliver was upset too, asking why Daddy hadn't come. Edward watched his son's disappointment from the window of his office, feeling a deep ache he hadn't expected. He realized that the rules of his business world didn't matter when it came to family and love. He tried to reach Sophie afterward, sending a few messages, but she didn't respond right away. She was proud, independent, and didn't want to seem desperate for his attention. Edward felt the emptiness return. His office felt colder, his mansion larger, and his work suddenly meaningless. Without Sophie, without the laughter of children around him, he realized just how isolated he had been. Days passed. Edward couldn't focus on meetings or decisions. He found himself thinking about Sophie constantly, her smile, her warmth, the way she treated people with kindness and respect. He thought about Max and how difficult her life was, and he realized that he wanted to be part of it, not just as a benefactor, but as a friend. Meanwhile, Oliver kept asking about Sophie, about when she would come back. "Daddy, when is she coming?" he asked one morning, clutching his toy car. Edward had no answer. He felt guilty, knowing that his own hesitation had caused his son pain. He promised himself he would make things right. Finally, Edward made a decision. He couldn't let fear of judgment or social rules keep him from doing what was right. He had to find Sophie to show her that he wasn't just a man with money, but a father who wanted to bring joy to his son, and a person willing to step outside his own comfort to help others. That evening, he left his office early and drove to her apartment. He didn't know what he would say, but he knew he had to see her to explain, to apologize if necessary. When he arrived, he found her sitting on the small couch, reading to Max. She looked up, surprised, but didn't hide her calm demeanor. "Mr. Langston," she said softly, "what brings you here?" Edward felt a lump in his throat. I wanted to apologize," he said, "for not being there, for canceling. That was wrong of me." Sophie studied him quietly, then nodded. "I understand," she said. Her tone was gentle but firm. "But words aren't enough. You have to show it." Edward realized she was right. He had let fear of judgment control his actions. But now, seeing her here, so brave and unwavering, he felt inspired. He wanted to do better, not for appearances, not for business, but for Oliver, for Max, and for Sophie, who had reminded him of what truly mattered in life that night. As Edward drove home, he felt a new determination. He would not let social pressure or fear of ridicule stop him from being the father Oliver needed, or from supporting Sophie in her life. The warmth he had felt during dinner with them lingered, reminding him that real happiness came from connection, kindness, courage. He didn't yet know how, but he was ready to take the first step. And this time, he would do it with an open heart. Without hesitation, and with the understanding that some of the most important lessons in life come from people who don't live in your world but whose hearts belong there anyway. Weeks passed since Edward had visited Sophie and Max at their small apartment. Every day he thought about them, their laughter, their struggles. and the warmth that Sophie had brought into his and Oliver's lives. The mansion, with all its luxury, felt emptier without her presence. Oliver missed her too, constantly asking when they would see her again. Edward knew he had to act, but he wanted to do it in a way that respected Sophie's independence. He finally decided to visit the hospital where Max was receiving therapy. He had quietly arranged support for the medical bills, not wanting her to know yet. When he arrived, he found Sophie sitting beside Max's bed, reading a story to him in a calm, soothing voice. Max's hands were shaky, but he followed along, smiling at her words. Edward felt a pang in his heart. Sophie had carried so much on her own, and here he was, watching from the doorway. Realizing that he could finally help, Sophie looked up and froze for a moment. "Mr. Langston?" she said cautiously. "What are you doing here?" Edward stepped inside gently. "I wanted to see how Max is doing," he said quietly, "and I wanted to apologize for everything, the canceled visits, my hesitation. I want to make things right." Sophie studied him for a long moment. Then she smiled faintly. "You can't fix everything with apologies," she said softly, "but you can try to be here now." Edward nodded. That was all he needed. Max looked up and gave a small wave. "Hi," he said shyly. Sophie smiled at him, ruffling his hair. "Say hello to our guest," she whispered. Max nodded, and Edward waved back. In that moment, Edward felt a surge of connection. He realized that for the first time, he wasn't an outsider looking in. He was part of their world, welcomed by them because he cared. Over the next few hours, Edward quietly helped around the hospital room. He brought small snacks for Max, organized books and toys, and even wheeled Max down the corridor to the therapy room. Sophie watched him, still skeptical, but slowly warming to his presence. She noticed he wasn't just helping for appearances. He genuinely wanted to make life easier for her and her brother. Edward stayed until Max was finished with his therapy. On the ride back, he didn't talk much, letting Sophie and Max sit comfortably. He noticed small details, the way Sophie tucked Max's blanket around him, the careful attention she gave to his comfort, the patience in her every movement. Edward had managed people and companies all his life, but he realized he had never encountered someone with such quiet strength and compassion. The following week, Edward invited Sophie and Max to the mansion again, but this time under no pretense of formality. It was simpler, casual dinner, just the three of them and Oliver. Sophie hesitated at first, worried about the grandeur, but Edward reassured her. "I don't want this to be about luxury," he said. "I just want us to spend time together." During dinner, Edward noticed the way Sophie made everyone feel at ease. She complimented the chef on small details, laughed freely, and even encouraged Max to share stories about his day. Oliver, thrilled to have both Sophie and Max at the table, chattered non-stop, and Edward finally allowed himself to relax and enjoy the moment. It was messy, lively, and imperfect, but it was real. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Sophie suggested a game for Oliver and Max, and soon the boys were running around, laughing while Edward watched from the sofa. He had never imagined that his home could feel so alive. Sophie's presence had transformed not just Oliver's mood, but the atmosphere of the entire house. Edward realized that happiness wasn't something he could buy. It was something that grew naturally when people cared for one another. Later that evening, as they were cleaning up, Sophie noticed Edward quietly organizing some papers. "You're still working?" she asked with a teasing smile. Edward laughed softly. "Old habits die hard," he admitted. Sophie shook her head. "You have to learn to slow down. Life isn't just about schedules and success." Edward looked at her, really looked, and saw the truth in her words. He had spent years chasing the wrong things, thinking money and power would fill the emptiness in his life. Now, watching her and the boys together, he understood what he had been missing. A few days later, Edward received a call from one of his investors, warning him again about public perception. This time, he didn't hesitate. He ended the call politely, but firmly, realizing that no amount of money or reputation could replace what he had discovered in Sophie and Max: real connection, love, and family. Edward began to make changes in his daily life. He cut back on long hours at the office, spent more time with Oliver, and regularly checked in on Sophie and Max. He helped with medical appointments, school activities, and even small errands. Sophie, initially cautious, gradually accepted his assistance. Realizing that he wasn't offering charity, he was offering friendship and support. Months passed, and Edward noticed a profound transformation in himself. He laughed more, listened more, and appreciated the simple joys of life. Oliver's laughter became a constant in the house, and the bond between father and son strengthened in ways Edward hadn't thought possible. Sophie became a trusted friend. Her presence, a source of comfort and joy rather than awkwardness or fear of judgment. One evening, as they all sat in the living room, Edward watched Oliver drop his toy car onto the carpet. Without hesitation, Sophie and Max both crawled on the floor to retrieve it, laughing as they pretended to race each other. Oliver clapped with delight, and Edward found himself smiling genuinely, a full smile that reached his eyes. He realized in that moment how far they had all come from strangers in a diner to a small, chosen family, finding happiness together. Edward understood that Sophie had taught him the most important lesson of all: love, kindness, and attention cannot be bought. They must be given freely, shared openly, and nurtured patiently. And he was determined to carry that lesson forward, not just for Oliver's sake, but for his own. From that day forward, Edward Langston's life was different. He still ran his business and managed his empire, but he did so with a new perspective. Time with Oliver, Sophie, and Max became sacred, more valuable than any deal or property. He supported the diner anonymously, ensuring Sophie and her coworkers could expand and thrive without feeling dependent on him. One quiet evening, Edward, Oliver, Sophie, and Max returned to the little diner where it all began. Oliver's toy car slipped from his hands again, rolling under the booth. The four of them laughed together as they crawled on the floor to retrieve it. Edward realized that life didn't have to be perfect or polished. Joy could be found in the simplest moments, in laughter shared and hands held, and in hearts connected, and in that small, bright diner. Edward Langston finally understood what he had been missing all those years: family, friendship, and the kind of happiness that no amount of wealth could ever buy. It was real, it was messy, and it was theirs forever.